Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Reviews. The book that we have today is How to Tell a Joke, an Ancient Guide to the Art of Humor. It's listed here as being Marcus Tullius Cicero, but it actually contains Cicero and Quintilian, and it's translated and introduced by Michael Fontaine, published by Princeton University Press. And if you've seen some of my earlier reviews in the series, you know that this is a book in a long series that's been coming out from Princeton University Press, How to Do XYZ, where they take some selections from ancient philosophy and then they translate them and publish them in a facing pages edition that we'll talk about in a little bit more. This series is focused on primarily books in philosophy, but philosophy understood quite broadly, so it extends to self-help and to leadership and organizational matters, and in this case, to jokes and humor and comedy. So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff, get into a good bit of detail about the book, and you can decide for yourself whether this is something that you might want to purchase for yourself. If you do, there's a Amazon link below that you can check out. It's an affiliate link, so of course I get a tiny little bit, and it might be a nice way of supporting the channel if you want to do that. So, a lot to say about this work. We begin by talking about the three S's, the style of the work, the structure of the work, and giving you kind of a summary. So why don't I do the summary first, because I think that'll lead naturally into all of the other dimensions of it. So it's really divided into two main sections. We've got translations from Cicero's De Oratore. That's the first half of the book, aside from the introduction. And then we have Quintilian's Institutio or Oratoria. And so these are being translated by the same person who is bringing a sort of unity to these. And what is the goal here? What is this text supposed to do? It's supposed to give you some idea about at least what some ancient thinkers thought about the art of humor, but specifically in relation to public speaking, rhetoric, oratory. And there's a lot of advice that's given in this that may or may not be as useful today as it was in ancient times. Actually, some of it might be a little bit more useful depending on which particular thing we're looking at. So the summary, what is the book about? Humor, jokes, and how we can use them and how we can classify them so we know what we're doing when we're telling jokes. Could you use this as a guidebook to become more witty, a better respondent, for example, in public debates or speaking? I think you could. That's part of what the original goal was. And, it might be helpful for that. Now, the style. Okay, so we've got two main authors being translated by one single translator. And I am going to have to talk a little bit later about the difficulty, which the author acknowledges, or the translator acknowledges, of going from one language and one cultural context to another with humor. It's a little bit more difficult than, say, doing plain old history or philosophy or something like that. So that's something to keep in mind. It is a facing page translation, which means that you've got the Latin on one side and the English corresponding to it on the other. Everything is nicely marked so you can tell exactly where things are. It's sort of like the Loeb classical editions, except a little bit more selective, not including quite so much in the works, not least because it's fairly large print with significant spacing. The book could probably be a good bit smaller if they hadn't done that, but some people might appreciate that larger print. And what we're getting in this are those two big blocks of text, and those two big blocks of text are giving us essentially summaries and breakdowns and quotations and some organization and some ideas about what is worth thinking about. I do want to point out that in addition to these two big blocks, we have a long introduction, which is, I think, actually quite good. Worth reading for its own sake, because the translator is talking about what they're doing in this. It begins with the question, is humor a teachable skill or something you're born with? Here's some people who actually brought it up. And then we learn about other authors, like, for example, Macrobius, who is quoting from this, or Plutarch, or, later on we hear about others as well. It talks about the format of the work, actually both of these works, who the speakers are in the dialogues, how the Renaissance picked this stuff back up, and then gets us essentially to the present time. And there's some notes about the translation. And I'm actually going to read just a tiny little bit of this because this may be important for you. Styles of translation vary. Some are literal, others go for the gist. This one goes for the jest, and it can claim a good pedigree. My job as translator, Cicero once remarked, is not to be a bank teller counting out coins for readers. It's to compensate them for the wait. In that spirit, I've racked my brains to find equivalent words, names, puns, phrasing, and cultural counterparts to make the jokes as funny in English as they are in Latin. I've also changed or suppressed details that would cause confusion or attract undue attention if kept in. You can call it paternalism, or you can call it good comedy. A comedian limits the distractions, so do I. And he also talks here about, having a pedigree. The first person to translate Cicero's jokes was Plutarch, and he gives you a few examples of that as well. So I think that gives you sufficient understanding about the, style and the structure. There's also a number of notes and a very short bibliography with some further reading. It's not a comprehensive discussion of humor by any means, but it'll get you started on some tracks that you can follow out. What are some of the main ideas or points or topics considered in this? Well, I've already brought up one that the translator highlighted from the very first sentence. Is comedy, is humor, is making jokes something that we can teach and learn and improve in, or is it something more like just an innate skill? So both of these authors that we're looking at and the translator would say that, okay, there definitely is some people who are more gifted, others who are less so, but you can definitely improve your capacity to tell and perhaps even appreciate jokes by doing some sort of training, and that's essentially what this is providing us with. Now, both of the authors' texts are aimed at ancient situations, and it's a challenge to apply this to modern times. We're in a very different culture. Some of the reference might not make as much sense or be as funny in the present as they were back then, but a lot of this is, I don't want to say completely universal, but certainly has stood the test of time. Now, there's two main works here, so what can we say about each of them? The section of Cicero's De Oratore begins by talking about kinds of humor and jokes, discusses how to make jokes, when we need to make jokes, when it can be useful or conducive, you might say, for us. And there's a dialogue going on here between the different people. So I'm going to just read a little bit here. Anthony is talking, and he says, you said we need to take stock of the people, the case, the circumstances, so that a joke won't compromise our authority. And it's true, Crassus really does this, but this rule applies to not making jokes when there's no need of them. What we're actually interested in is how to use them when we do need them, as, for example, against an opponent, and especially how to trigger a stupid, eager, lightweight witness when the audience looks receptive to him. So a lot of this is within, you could say, circumstances where there's a contest going on, right? The law courts, for example, or the forum are providing a lot of examples. And then there are 5 guiding questions that get asked about laughter. So as not to keep you all waiting any longer, I'll outline the whole shebang. When it comes to laughter, there are 5 questions to ask. What is it? Where does it come from? Should an orator want to make people laugh? If so, how much? And what are the different kinds of jokes? And then, the narrator, or rather the interlocutor, discusses each of these in turn, and one of them is going to get a bit more study than the others, and that's the 5th question, the different kinds of jokes. And much of the rest of this selection from Cicero's De Oratore is going to be classification of the, as it turns out, many different kinds of jokes that you can use. So there's some preliminary questions, and then there's a lot of, let's lay it all out for you. What about the quintillion section? So this is deeper on in the book, and Quintilian says that he's going to bring laughter into important domains. And he begins by saying, should we actually be thinking about this? And he's referencing Cicero, which is a good reason for bringing this up. And, he goes through a number of different steps and then says, humor is risky. As Cicero says, laughter has its home in some ugliness and disgrace. It's called urbanity when you draw attention to it in others. When it boomerangs back at the speaker, it's called stupidity. Laughter also seems like a minor thing, something that any stand-up comedian, street performer, or idiot can get. Nevertheless, it does have a certain overpowering and conquering force where all resistance is futile. So, he's acknowledging that humor can play an important role even in domains that seem quite serious. He then goes on to consider whether we can teach humor to other people. And he says a couple interesting things. Genetics don't merely determine whether a person is wittier and quicker at coming up with ideas. Teaching really can improve that. Some people just intrinsically have a special look about them, the way they move, their face, such that the same jokes don't seem as funny when somebody else tells them. And I think that's probably quite true. But then he says, the right opportunity, though, hinges on both situations and also on what a prior speaker says, because every quip is much more fun as a comeback than a provocation. And he's talking about other things that make humor difficult. And he says, quite interestingly, there are no practice lessons for it, no teachers. Now, this book is giving us practice lessons for it, kind of in outline, isn't it? And then he says, still nothing's ever stopped anyone from creating instructional materials suitable for it, like mock debates that would be genuinely funny or special prompts to drill students in it. It's the opposite, actually. If we systematize them a bit or added a bit of seriousness to the mix, one thing that could be really useful are those cut downs that we use to take turns exchanging on anything goes days. At the moment, they're just a one-upping game for students having fun. So he's, giving some consideration to the question, how much can we actually teach about this? Then we see Quintilian discussing 6 different kinds or modalities of humor. He says we use a number of different names for the same thing, and if we look at them separately, each one will reveal its own special properties. And I'm not going to outline all these. I'll just mention what they are. Urbanity, the charming, salty or zesty, the witty, which is coming from the word facetum, where we get facetious from, a joke, a jocus, right? And then, interestingly, being a jerk. He says, dikikatias is obviously derived from the word to say, dicere, right? And so there's these 6 different kinds. And then he starts going into, he talks about humor and its uses, but then he talks about, sort of like Cicero did, what are the different kinds of jokes? What are their situations? How do we actually use them? And then he'll talk about other things. So he's got this interesting section, how to get a laugh and win the room, targets, who are we aiming humor at, and techniques to use. So this is, again, providing some guidance for tell a joke like this in this sort of circumstance. These are also tied in with rhetorical categories. Quintilian, as well as Cicero, are teachers of rhetoric. So he talks about brainstorming, style of presentation, all of these sorts of matters. And then he goes into a lot of different types and techniques through most of the rest of the things, sort of similar to Cicero. But then there's also this appendix on urbanity. What is it to be urbane, right? And he talks about a famous poet, Domitius Marsus, and considers some of their ideas in this. So those are the main points. That's what you're going to see discussed in this work, should you choose to get your hands on it and read it. So what did I find particularly good about this work? What can I tell you about it that might, lean you towards checking it out? So I did really like the introduction, and there's a couple features of it that I thought were quite good. The short history of these texts and thinkers, it's just enough, it's not too much, but it gives you good guiding points for how to think about this stuff and how we might, follow out that thread into our own time. As I've mentioned already, translating is a difficult business. Translating humor is probably more difficult than many other types of literature that we're going to focus on. And I think that there's a great discussion about just how hard that can be by this translator, Michael Fontaine. And I think that the whole thing is quite readable, which matters quite a bit. These are texts that we typically study as academics, but I think this is great for a broader public to learn a bit about ancient humor and how we could update it to the present. It's actually funny in parts, and it's not just Cicero and Quintilian and the people who they bring up who are funny. It's also Fontaine in his introduction. And I would say that Fontaine himself, as a translator, is contributing to the humor by trying to find useful equivalents as best as he can that work in this. And I do like that pun that he had, I'm not going to give you the gist of it, I'm going to give you the jest of it. I think he's really trying to do that well. And the authors themselves, if you've ever read Cicero or Quintilian, you know that they're worth reading in part because they're going to give you lots and lots of examples. This is actually, just as a side note, in rhetoric, in Latin, sometimes they use the term copia. It's the word that we get copia from, right? Or cornucopia, the horn of plenty. This is a specific technique or organizational method. You give the reader lots and lots of material in an organized fashion so that they can make sense out of what they're reading and relate the principles to the examples and then see how they might apply it outside of the scope of the work itself. There's also a lot of great classification and distinctions made in both of the texts, so I think that could be quite helpful for a general reader. There's lots of interesting insights and analysis, again, both on the part of the two main authors, Cicero and Quintilian, and also on the part of Fontaine, I would say. So that makes it a pretty strong work, and I think there's a lot to recommend this if you are interested in the topic of humor. You know, if you were going to have a bookshelf devoted to this and you had things like, Bergson's laughter or Freud's jokes on the unconscious or, Bakhtin's Rabelais and his world, these, treatises that are more contemporary, I think this would probably deserve to be there alongside of those. It could be quite useful, quite helpful, part of the literature for you. What did I find, if not bad, at least problematic about the work? So I'm going to start with a very general criticism that I've been raising against the books in this series. Having the Latin or in some cases Greek and English on facing pages, sort of like what the Loeb classical edition does, it looks cool. I don't know that many readers are actually going to be checking out the original language. So you're kind of paying for a book that's twice the size that it needs to be. I mean, it could have been done where the English was provided on both pages and then just, occasional terms are provided in brackets. And, the book is, because of the way it's designed, way, way longer than it needs to be. I mean, you can take a look and see with the spacing that you're certainly filling up a lot of blank space in these pages. And that's kind of a minor criticism, but I don't know, it might be important for some of you who are watching this and considering whether to get the book. One thing that I also didn't like in the design of the book, and let me find a good page where we see this, is that the quotes by other authors are put into these weird kind of blocky things that I understand why they might want to do it, but it just doesn't look all that great. So here is a page where they're doing this, right? For example, here's how Cicero peppered Fabricus' famous getaway, and so then it sets it out. See how it's in gray? There's many choices that you could make as an editor about how to lay things out. I just don't think that's particularly good, and it's not really consistent at every point, I would say, as well. But again, kind of a minor quibble. Occasionally, the translator, as the translators admit, I'm going to leave some things out. Sometimes they've actually added some things in, I think a little bit unnecessarily, in ways that could be confusing to a reader who can't check out the Latin. So, for example, in talking about, there's this line here, Novius is full of this kind of thing, one's common. Guess what, Mr. Stoic? If it gets cold, you will shiver. But there's no mention of Stoic in there whatsoever. Sapiens, si algebis, tremes. That's the Latin for that. there isn't any reference to Stoics. So why are you bringing that up, and why is it capitalized? It's a choice on the part of Fontaine to try to convey something, but, given how important Stoicism is to Cicero and in ancient times, I think this is inviting some misunderstandings on the part of the Latinless reader. So, maybe there's a little bit of fast and looseness there that, we should ask ourselves. It's a book about humor. Is this conducing to the funniness? Is this helping us to understand it, or is it leading us in the wrong direction? I think we can say that at a couple different points. The other thing that I will say, and again, this is kind of a minor criticism, and I'm very, very cognizant as a translator myself about how hard it is to translate things well. So it's tough to convey humor just going from one contemporary language to another, or even in just English itself. We can have contexts where we rely upon slang, and what was funny, in the way that people talked 50 years ago isn't funny anymore, and vice versa, or across, various different subcultures. So going from ancient Latin to contemporary 21st century English, there's bound to be some difficulties in doing this. I just want to give you one example that might not translate that well, even in contemporary English. So there's a reference, here we go. This is, Metellus was drafting men for the army and wouldn't accept my excuse of poor eyesight, so you can't see anything. He asked, actually, I can. I said, I can see your McMansion from the Esquiline Gate. Okay, so, Villam tuam is what is being translated here as McMansion. And, for me, McMansion, I know what a McMansion is because it's an American term that we use for these very drab-looking, gigantic houses that people build in subdivisions, and they all kind of look the same, way more houses, we say, than a person needs. Would that make as much sense to other English readers in the world? Ooh, maybe not. So maybe that's a little too American. There's a reference there basically to McDonald's and fast food, and then to houses, and it's just translating the word villa. So there are some places where, as a Latin reader, I'm not entirely comfortable with the way it's translated, but again, he translated it, I didn't. So, and I do translate other things. So I'm pretty willing to give translators the proverbial benefit of the doubt, and I don't want to tear it down. So you notice my complaints, criticisms are pretty trivial stuff. On the whole, they're not anything that would damn the book, right? And I'm not also damning it with faint praise, as the saying goes. All right, so my final thoughts on this. I recommend it. I don't have a qualified recommendation. I would say if you're interested in the topic of humor, considered from, let's call them, both experiential, empirical perspectives, but also theoretical perspectives, it's a good book. You probably want to get your hands on it and read it through. It's certainly showing you how much attention was being given to this by some rather funny but also very intelligent people who were concerned with education quite broadly, with society, and specifically with the force of rhetoric or oratory or persuasive communication. So I think it's a pretty good book, and I certainly enjoyed reading through it. I'm going to keep it and read through it again sometime down the line, and maybe do a closer study and maybe even incorporate some of these techniques and jokes and ways of being a funny person. So yeah, that's what I have to say about it. I think the translations on the whole are pretty good. I've registered my, not even complaints, but more like misgivings about a few of them. But on the whole, I would say it's quite a task that Fontaine pulled off here in translating and then providing a great introduction and some other resources for you about humor and jokes.